So before we jump into the actual content, I just have a question for all of you. We all have different perspectives on what we think great speakers look like, and I'm just curious if you could share who are some of the speakers that you admire, but whether they're famous or not. And after you tell me who they are, tell me a little bit about why you think they're great speakers. So I'd love to hear from you.
Rich DeVos is one of the co-founders of the Amway Corporation, and he's a riveting speaker.
So he's riveting, which means
He's riveting, yeah.
I love that term. And what does he do specifically that really grabs your attention?
Very motivational.
So you could see his passion when he speaks, right?
Absolutely.
Excellent.
And he speaks with no notes.
Very good. Very good. What else? Who else do we admire, and why do we admire them from a public speaking standpoint?
I have one, Stephen Covey.
Okay. And tell me more. What do you like about Steve?
He was so logical, and it made me want to take notes and run out of the room and go do exactly what he was talking about doing. It was just, it was compelling.
Compelling. And you know what I liked about what you said too about taking notes, Michelle, there is he was teaching you, right? And that translated into some sort of action that you took. So it wasn't just entertaining, and great speakers can be entertaining, but if you walk away 20 minutes later, a half hour later, and there's nothing actionable that you can do, well, then you were just entertained, and there's nothing wrong with that. But this is more important. Yes?
Brené Brown,
Okay.
I think, is a very, compelling speaker. I've watched her TED Talks, and she speaks on things that I think impact everyone.
So
like vulnerability and
so the topics are important, right?
Right.
And that particular speaker, so it's something that made a connection with you from a heart standpoint, or things that you care about. Good. Yes.
Jennifer Page,
Okay.
who is, she's spoken before at our conferences. She's a heart mom and a really strong advocate for CHD awareness. But I remember her speech was just so honest and just so much passion, and you could just really feel, all how she was feeling, and really be in her story with her. And
So she clear.
yes,
And vulnerable, and that's an important quality, right? Because we all of us, I think, can connect with people who maybe don't have everything figured out, right? And people who are vulnerable in front of others, I think, make that connection. I also think her credibility, right? Because as you described who she was, I obviously didn't know who she was. Clearly, her speaking about those particular topics, she brought a level of credibility that meant a lot. How about one more? One more that you admire and why you admire them, public speakers?
Anyone with humor.
Sense of humor. Okay. Yeah. And I mean, there's a lot of people who use that. And what about that do you really like? Why does that make a difference for you?
It captures your attention, and it also it reinforces everything, and it's memorable.
It's so true. The use of humor. If it's only humor, then obviously it's comedy, right? But people who can use humor in a serious topic really makes a difference. And like you said, it's much more memorable. So excellent. Well, thank you all for sharing. These are great examples, and we all emulate others. And so whether you've seen one of your fellow volunteers who has been a great presenter, or if you've seen a presentation that's been made, maybe you've observed Michelle. I happen to think she's a very good speaker. You can take a little bit from these people that you admire and implement them into your own public speaking style. So those are great examples. So what I'd like to do now is this will be the point where we'll work off of that worksheet that you're using. And I mentioned to you that I want to share with you a framework for approaching public speaking. So just to reiterate our objectives for this session, I'm going to introduce you to this framework. We're going to talk about some best practices to be used during your presentations, and then finally, I'll go over that tool, that planning tool for you. But the way that I want to introduce this framework to you is a way that I hope is memorable for you, and that's through the use of a metaphor. And this is a technique that you can use for your public speaking as well. Is illustrations and metaphors are very helpful for people to remember, as are your stories. But first of all, what do you see on the screen here? What is this? It's a rowboat. Everybody's at least been in a rowboat at some point in their life. Maybe you've even, done the rowing yourself, right? Now, let me ask you a question. If you get into a rowboat and you put the paddles in the water and you just barely move them, I mean so slow that you're almost not even pushing the water, what's going to happen? Nothing, right? You're not going to go anywhere. And if there are people in the boat with you, what are they going to be? How are they going to feel? Frustrated, bored, annoyed. Exactly. Now, conversely, let's just say I have a 13-year-old son at home, and his big thing is he's figured out Mountain Dew. And so let's say we've had a Mountain Dew, and we jump in the boat, and we start rowing really, really fast and splashing water all over the place. What's going to happen?
We go, but not efficiently.
Yeah, we're going to barely move, whether we like it or not, but we're going to cause a whole lot of ruckus and distraction and things like that. And I want you to think of this rowboat metaphor when you think about public speaking. And that is, you have some people who, when they speak in public, are really, really slow, and they cover every single detail, and they might even read the slides to you, right? Now, that's going to bore the participants just like the people sitting in the rowboat. Conversely, then you have the other people up here and really, really fast. They're going fast, and they're going back and forth on slides, et cetera, et cetera. And then that's really going to frustrate people as well and not get you anywhere. Because when we speak in public, we're trying to communicate something to somebody that especially in the advocacy world, leads them to take some action. And so I want you to think of a component of that rowboat as our framework for public speaking. And what is it? OR. Very good. So we're going to use the acronym of OR to help you think about public speaking. I want to keep it that simple. So this is where you'll refer to your worksheets here. And we're going to go through each of these, OAR, and I'll describe this framework to you as well as talk about the actual presentation. So first of all, the O in OR stands for organization. This stands for organization. Now, some of you might feel like you're in church right now because this might look like one of the guides that they use where they have you fill in the blanks. There's a technique there. I'm not saying for you to do that on your advocacy days, by the way. So the O stands for organization, and I'll describe what each of these means in a little more detail, but essentially this is how you plan for the presentation. So before I stepped up here and started speaking to all of you, I actually had a plan for how I was going to approach this, and so we'll talk about that. Then the A stands for articulation. Articulation. And this is just quite simply the speaking. This is whether you're at a small table meeting with 2 or 3 people, or you're in front of 20, 30 people at a Kiwanis club in your community. This is the articulation. This is the presentation that you're making. All right? And then the R, often forgotten, reflection. Reflection. And reflection not only occurs during the presentation, and I'll model some of that for you today, but especially after the presentation. Now, when I asked the question earlier if public speaking makes any of you a little nervous, and some of you raised your hands, sometimes public speaking feels a little bit like an out-of-body experience. Meaning you get yourself, you're so ginned up for it and excitable and it's a great presentation and people are giving you a lot of feedback or not. And then you walk out and you're just so thankful that it's over and you're tired. And one of the things that we don't do is then reflect upon what we communicated. Do I need to follow up with anybody? Did I meet my objective, et cetera? And that's really what the R stands for. So pretty simple framework. It's the OR in a rowboat. And it stands for, without looking at your notes, what's the O stand for? The A and the R. A students in Mended Hearts, I have to tell you, Michelle. All right. Let's go through these a little bit more one-to-one, and I'm going to come back to the podium here just so that I'm not a distraction with my flailing arms and everything. We'll start with organization. And, you heard one of the staffers up here, here to the left, I've forgotten her name with glasses. But she said, do you remember she said, know your audience? She was talking about going to visit a member of Congress and make sure that you know your audience. So one of the first things that you do during this organization of your presentation is that you identify who's the audience. Now think about some of the audiences that you at Mended Hearts would be speaking to. Who are some of, if we're thinking about making presentations, we've talked about Congress already, but who are some of the other people that you might make presentations to? Executives like in a hospital? So business executives as well. And if I may, they may have a little different priority set than we do, don't they? Okay. Who else? Other types of people that you'd speak to? To healthcare providers, physicians. Very good. Patients. That's right. Civic organizations with just general groups of people. Yeah, and then a specific class focused on cardiac care, like a cardiac rehab class. And so we can see how each of those audiences might have different motivations, things that are different in terms of their importance to them. Surprisingly, folks, a lot of people, they'll have just kind of a canned presentation that they make to everybody, and they just make it to everybody. And so one of the most important things, and that's why it's at the top of the list, is to really think about who your audience is and what's important to them. Secondly, then, is of course what's the topic that you're going to cover? What's the content that you're going to cover? Is it an introduction to Mended Hearts, the organization? Is it about a specific program that you want to speak to them in the hospital? Whatever the case may be. The great news is it sounds like Andrea and the team are going to equip you with a lot of content as you need it, so that regardless of the topic, you'll be able to pull from that content to build your presentation. So that's a good thing. Third is what is your objective? So another blank space for you there. What is your objective or your goal for the presentation? And a lot of people struggle with this because they think, well, I'm going to share the information that I'm charged to share with them. But if you think just sort of one step past that, what is it that I want these individuals that I'm speaking to do after I leave? And that really becomes your goal or your objective. So for me, as an example for this presentation, I wanted you to walk away with a framework for public speaking, the OR framework. I want you to walk away with some techniques that you can use during, especially the articulation. And then I wanted you to have a tool that you could take with you and use to plan. That was my goal and you'll tell me on the smiley sheet forms afterwards if we achieved that. But that was a goal that I had. And so if we all approach our presentations in that way during this organization step, then you'll be in a great place. The next part really has to do with the setting for your presentation, and that's format, flow, and media. And by this I mean, is it a formal presentation? So if you're speaking to executives, maybe a CEO and his or her staff, that's going to be a little bit more formal than perhaps a particular physician that you've met through a secondary relationship and you're having a quick discussion with them in the hallway. So how you approach it from a formality standpoint, you're all smart people and have great judgment, so use that judgment to decide how formal or informal the presentation should be. Obviously, if you're sitting around the table with people, it can be formal, but clearly a little bit more of a discussion-based presentation than just sort of reviewing slides and that sort of thing. So use your best judgment. You all know your settings better than I do. As far as the flow goes, this is very important. By flow, you could also think of it as a content outline. And one of the things that I do, let me see if I can grab it here. It sounds crazy, but one of the things that I do when I'm trying to develop a presentation is I just take a big old piece of paper and I start drawing pictures and writing words. And basically that helps me to outline my presentation, and it includes slides, and if I'm going to go to the flip chart, I'll draw a little picture of the flip chart, things like that. But you don't have to be that sophisticated, but having a plan for an outline for what you hope to communicate is really important. And the good news is on that tool on the back, I've captured that there as well. But that's what I mean by flow. And then finally, media. You know, in events like this, we've sort of created a culture here in the U.S. where we always have slides, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm sure you'll all be in settings where you might not have the benefit of slides or a projector. So what are you going to do, though, to help grab people's attention with visuals beyond just you speaking to them? And I've seen some of the great materials that you all have in Mended Hearts, and you absolutely want to include those. You heard one of the staffers from Columbus, Ohio say they like the one-pagers, you know, backgrounders and things like that. So even if you don't have slides, you have the opportunity to share those things with them. And then finally, when it comes to this organization step, which is really your preparation, too many people put a lot of effort into organizing their presentation, and then they don't practice. And do I have any golfers in the room? Got a couple of you. All right. Now, I want you to imagine that you've spent a lot of time watching the Golf Channel, reading Golf Digest, and you've come up with a new technique for hitting your driver, and you went out and bought a new driver, and then you stepped out on the first tee and you played that day with that driver. How would that go, do you think?
You got to make sure you hit it good.
Yeah.
If you don't hit it good, you take it back.
Exactly. And don't put any marks on it. But my point of that is that practice is so important. And folks, I know it feels very silly, and I know this from personal experience. It feels very silly sometimes to practice by yourself because you're sort of hoping that nobody sees you, and you feel a little silly even if you're maybe looking in a mirror or something like that. But what I would say is if you have it's always important to practice, even if it's just sitting down and kind of mumbling it to yourself. But if you have something that's really important to you, like going to speak to a CEO about support or going to a hospital to talk about bringing Mended Hearts, those are definitely times where you want to practice your presentation and make sure that you have it down. What I always say is on the screen here is the presentation itself shouldn't be the first time that you give that presentation, all right? So that's organization there. Any questions on that? Pretty straightforward, all right. So now we're going to talk about articulation. And with articulation, I have a little bit of fun with this. There was a study done by a UCLA professor. The sources here, his name is Albert Mehrabian. And this was actually done back in the 60s. And he was a professor of psychology who focused specifically on communication, on effective communication, what makes it effective and what doesn't make it effective. And he came up with basically 3 components for communication. And he said that these are really the 3 areas that make up our communication and how effective it is. The first are the words that we say, right? And that's pretty straightforward. The second is what's the voice or the tone that we use. And this is the cadence of your speaking, the speed, how loud or how soft you're speaking, etc. And then finally, the last aspect are nonverbals. And these are our gestures, our movement, our eye contact, all of that. So on your sheets there, you have blanks. And I will tell you that each of those 3 percentages add up to 100%, okay? So words, vocal, and nonverbals, okay? And if you were to guess, and go ahead and do this on your sheets there, what percentage each of those components make up effective communication, they will total 100%. So just take 30 seconds to yourself there. Don't put too much thought into it, and write down what you think those percentages are. Okay, at least everybody's probably guessed at this point. So let's start with words. What percentage of effective communication do you think Dr. Mehrabian believed are affected by our words? What would you say? Anybody venture a guess? Yes, sir. 20%. All right, that's a good guess. Any others? 60%, really high. 40%. Did anybody have 10% or less? Randy, what did you have, Randy? 10%. Well, you would all be very interested to know that Dr. Mehrabian's research showed that words are only 7% of the effectiveness of our communication. Really surprising. Let me say that to you in a different way. What that means is if we only focus on our words, we're going to be ineffective 93% of the time. So the point of sharing that with you, well, let me finish this and then I'll come back. How about the vocal elements? What did you all have for that? 50? 30? 60? Okay. So some closer ones with this. This one actually came out to be 38%. 38%. And just think back to your childhood, right? And my name's Mike. And when I heard Michael, then I kind of knew what was coming, right? So that vocal element and the formal use of my name. So 38%. So which means we can do the math here that saying nothing is 55% of effective communication. Can you believe that? Pretty incredible. Now, why do I share this with you? What does this mean? I will tell you that there are people who create presentations who obsess about the words that they say that they're going to share. They obsess about the words. And don't get me wrong, words are important. They're a part of the whole package here. But it's how you deliver those words through your voice, tone, pace, pitch, volume, and then of course the gestures that you use, the eye contact that you make. The combination of those two things is really where the effective communication comes in. All right? So very good. So you guys have figured that one out. Now, easier said than done sometimes. Remember earlier we talked about the rowboat, and I said if you put the paddles, the oars in the water, and you start going really, really fast when you're nervous, you make a lot of splashing and you don't get anywhere. That happens sometimes with public speaking as well. And what I always try to tell people as best possible, because if you're like me, you're thinking about the presentation the night before when you're trying to fall asleep, and it means that you're not going to sleep as well. And then you're all jacked up just before you make the presentation. And so you have to sometimes learn some techniques that help you to calm down a little bit. For some people, it's breathing. For some people, it's maybe taking some water or whatever the case may be. But do your best to try to get yourself to relax before you actually get up and speak. And that'll help you to have a nice rhythmic pace. Because I didn't say this earlier with the rowboat, but for those of you who've been in a rowboat and used it well, it's those nice, smooth, rhythmic paces, rows, that help you to get from A to B in the best and efficient manner. Now, this part's especially important for all of you because you have these wonderful stories and anecdotes that could be shared to make that connection with the audience. So earlier when you told me about some of the people who were impressive to you as speakers, you talked about some of those stories. You talked about the things that they share, and you all have ready-made content for that. It's called your story. And at either the next session for you or the one after that, Mary Hallowell, one of my colleagues, is going to talk to you about how do we take your story and really harness it and make it the most effective. But those stories and anecdotes make a huge difference. Did anybody notice what I did at the very beginning of the presentation? It was after my story about myself personally, but did anybody, and I've done it a couple of times, and I wonder if you noticed it in terms of telling you where we were going. Did anybody notice that? I said what I was hoping to accomplish here. Yeah. There's a technique here. This says frame or set up your presentation, but I like to call it the tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. And I've observed in so many different settings of presentations of people who just jump right into content, and they don't let the audience know where they're going. Now, that's fine, I guess, if you're choosing to be at a conference where you're hoping to hear some great things and you're going to learn and you sort of expect to get this major download. But when you're talking to a legislator or a hospital administrator or a busy healthcare professional and you come upon them and you're going to share something with them or to their staff, it so much helps the conversation get off to the right start if you tell them what you hope to accomplish in the conversation. Today I'm going to share with you a little bit about Mended Hearts. We're going to talk about a specific program around cardiac rehab. And then when we leave, I hope to be able to leave some of our information with you that you can share with your staff. And if you start out your presentation and set it up that way during this articulation step, you're going to have reached your goals so much more effectively. All right. Eye contact is really important. I like to call it counting noses. And by this I mean, you can have a tendency, not everybody's going to give you their eye contact as a presenter. But what I will tell you is unfortunately what happens sometimes is the person who does, what is your name? Megan is as a presenter, everybody loves to have a Megan in their crowd. Because Megan is eyes on me. She's giving me nonverbal feedback as I'm presenting, and Megan's a go-to person. So when I need to make a point or I need to have eye contact, I'm going to look at Megan and she's smiling. But the problem is sometimes if I'm not comfortable in this setting, I'm only going to ever look at Megan and I'm going to ignore everybody else. So we like to call this counting noses. And literally, I'm looking at all of your noses right now, and I'm counting them, and I know how many noses are in the room. And it's kind of a corny thing, but it helps you to make sure that you're including everybody in the conversation. So whether it's a small sort of staff meeting presentation like at a table or a larger group like this, you want people to feel like you're engaged with them and that you're tracking with them. So I like to call that counting noses. Now, the other thing is something that I call a miner's cap, and I'm actually going to step out for this one. And this is when you get to the point where you're asking questions, or especially the Q&A portion, where people are raising their hands and they're asking questions. So let's say again, Megan asks me a question, and so Megan, just ask me anything at this point. It doesn't matter what it is.
So where are you from?
Where am I from? I'll be happy to tell you that. Well, Megan, as a matter of fact, I'm from Canton, Ohio, home of what's in Canton, Ohio? Pro Football Hall of Fame. Thank you very much. That's about all there is in Canton these days. But when Megan's asked me a question, that was a really short question, but sometimes if it's a longer question or Megan has a comment that she's making like earlier, as the presenter, one of the things, whether I'm up in front of the room or I'm sitting down, is I want to pretend like I have a miner's cap on. And what's on a miner's cap? A light. And I want the light to be flashed on Megan, because I want Megan to know that whatever she's asking me or whatever she's telling me is extremely important, and I want to hear it. And so as I hear it and I'm absorbing it, I'm also thinking about my response. Now, when it's time to respond, then of course you can respond to everybody else. But that's an important technique, especially if you're doing larger meetings, maybe you're presenting at a local community center or something like that, because you want people to feel safe to ask questions, but you also want them to know that you care. All right? And so I like to call that the miner's cap technique. I also strongly recommend, and this is really hard because our dialect and our language is developed over many, many years, and we all use fillers. And we know what the fillers are, right? They're they're so, they're you guys, they're like, they're all of those things. And they're not bad, but sometimes the overuse of fillers is because maybe we're speaking too much. And so it gets back to the Moravian study. Fillers become words. And one of the reasons that words are less effective is if we use so or like in between every sentence, then we start to discount the words themselves and their importance. So just be mindful of those. Like I say, we've all developed those little fillers over many, many years, but just something to be thinking about, especially if you're doing a more formal presentation. And then finally, I hope I've modeled this well today, but if you can ask questions during your presentation, make yourself stop and ask a question, whether it's a polling question, how many of you, or does anyone, these types of questions that engage people during your presentation. And remember, during that organization step, that's a great time to just jot down a couple of spots where you might want to ask a question of the group. So if it doesn't come naturally to you and you're a little nervous and you're just going to start sharing, if you have it sort of in your notes to ask a question here or there, that's going to prompt you to do that. All right? Any questions on articulation? All right. Well, then the last step is reflection. And interestingly enough, reflection is probably the most important part of the presentation. And that is because this is where people will either mentally or physically through taking action, absorb and apply the dialogue that you're having, the presentation that you're making. And so that's where, the question and I think one of the things the group's done a really nice job of here over the last day and a half is every session has been sort of light content and then plenty of time for Q&A. And that's hugely important because not only does it allow you to ask questions that maybe weren't covered, but in the responses, it gives you an opportunity to apply what you're hearing. And so that is extremely important. Unfortunately, though, a lot of us will use up all of our articulation time, during articulation, and then we don't have time for that. And, that's a loss. So whatever you can do to maybe have the content be a little bit less so that you save time for that's always a good thing. Key takeaways and summary. So what are the things that you want people to walk away with? So remember that tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. It might feel repetitive to you, but it's not. It really helps. So there's a lot of research that says we need to hear something 6 or 7 times before it really sticks. Time for the questions and answers. We've talked about that. And then these last couple of bullets are really what you do after the presentation. And I strongly recommend, I know we all have busy lives and we kind of move from one thing to the next, but taking the time, even if it's 5 minutes, to sit down and say, okay, did I accomplish my goal with that presentation today? And just answer that question. And then finally, are there any follow-ups required? And taking the time, oh yes, there was the one individual who was the CFO of the company that I spoke to, and he asked me for some statistics on Mended Heart's financials or whatever the case may be, so that you make sure that you get back to those people, so that much like the miner's cap, where we want people to feel like they're being heard and we're paying attention to them, we also want people to feel like when they've asked us for something that we're going to follow up on that. And I have to believe a group like Mended Hearts, this comes very natural for all of you. Then if you flip the page over to the other side, this is something that I put together for you all. It's not the most sophisticated thing in the world, but I hope it will be helpful, and that's why I created it. It sort of builds upon this framework that I just introduced you to, and I think in pretty short order, maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Some of you, if it's a really big, important presentation, you could spend more time. But in the goal of this is to help you just to be able to sit down and really think about, how am I going to organize this presentation? What's my goal, the topic, the audience? And it asks you some questions there, and you can put as much detail as you would like. And then it gets into how you're going to deliver the articulation, which is really that format, the flow, and the media. So you see it asks several of the questions here that we've talked about, some of the key questions that you want to ask during the presentation from a reflection standpoint, media, etc. And then finally, if you have that 3 to 5 minutes after the presentation, you can just write at the bottom of this form, did I accomplish my goal? Is there any follow-up? And then the last 2 questions are really more self-reflection from sort of a self-coaching standpoint. What went well? What did I do really well in that presentation? And I start there for a reason, because as human beings, we seem to naturally want to go to the, oh man, I really blew that one. I was terrible. And I don't want you to do that. I guarantee you that you did something very well in that presentation. Let's get that on paper, because you're going to build on those strengths. But also, too, it's important that we reflect, what could I have done a little better, and then apply that to my next presentation. And so quickly, with this form, you can capture your follow-ups and next steps, but also do a little bit of self-reflection. So I hope you'll find this useful. We will have these blank forms available through the Mended Hearts folks, so that you can download those from the portal and make sure that you have access to those, and I hope that you'll use them. So in summary, just a few key takeaways. This is the tell them what you told them part, right? Just a few key takeaways. First of all, I love the quote. I'm jumping on the quote bandwagon here. Victor Hugo is a French artist. I work for a French company, so I have access to some extra quotes. Now, in all seriousness, his quote was, "Failing to plan is planning to fail," and that's why that organization is so important. Implementing these best practices that we've talked about today through the articulation over time, and they'll improve your ability to have impact in those presentations. So a lot of the things that I've talked about today, I'm sure many of you do naturally, but maybe there are one or two things that you can improve upon. Maybe it's cutting out some of the fillers. Maybe it's being sure to ask questions during a presentation instead of just presenting. If you start to apply some of those best practices to your presentations, then over time your presentations are just going to continue to get better and better. And then finally, always save time for reflection, not only during the presentation, but also to make sure that you summarize at the end and answer any questions that your folks might have.